right, welcome back to On the Ball, the podcast from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and our guest today is an old good friend of mine, Michael Butterworth, joining us from Austin at the University of Texas, where he is the Governor Ann W. Richards Chair for the Texas Program in Sports and Media, professor in the Communication Studies Department, and director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media. His program has just put out their annual Politics and Sports Media report, which is something I look forward to reading every year. And this is the first time we'll have a chance to talk about it. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. Thanks a bunch for inviting me and for taking an interest in the report.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to check out your bio, to properly introduce you today. And I saw in there, unfortunately, that you're a Cubs fan, like a big Cubs fan.
Yeah.
I'm from Wisconsin originally, so I'm a Brewers fan. I don't know what to say about this other than like I was really happy we beat the Cubs in the playoffs, this year. I don't know if you have any comebacks to that. But anyway, we'll try to get along as well as possible during this interview.
I consider it's a friendly rivalry. I spent 3 years living in Milwaukee. My wife and I lived in Milwaukee in the early 2000s and went to many Brewers games and always really enjoyed that. So if the Cubs aren't going to win the division, then I want it to be Milwaukee.
All
And I
right.
think we can mutually agree as long as it's not St. Louis, we're all good.
That's true. That's true. We can unite over that. Are you a Bears fan too?
Indeed.
All right. So my next door neighbor here in the office is Earl Bennett, former Bears wide receiver, former Vanderbilt receiver, now helping run the athletic department here. When the Packers beat the Bears earlier this season, I put one of my obnoxious Packer parkas on his door. And then when the Bears beat the Packers in the playoffs, I still haven't heard the end of it. So
As should be the case. I hope he has one of those cheese grater hats that have
yeah,
become
yeah.
a big
I
deal.
don't know.
Yeah.
Every time he walks by, bear down, Andrew, bear down. So all right. Well, let's get to the meat of this conversation. So this is your fifth annual report on politics and sports media. What was the genesis of getting this started in the first place 5 years ago?
Right. We had conversations for a couple of years before we launched the report about wanting to have a research-driven contribution that would be accessible to non-academic audiences. So the logic behind the report is that we'll have a public-facing publication at the very beginning of the year, which is a retrospective look back, and then we'll use that to generate academic work. So it's not that we don't want that to be a component, but we really wanted to channel the talents and expertise of all of the folks who affiliate with the Center for Sports Communication and Media. And it was a little bit of a process to decide what that contribution would be. My research agenda is to study the relationship between politics and sports, but I didn't want that to necessarily dictate what the collective research agenda should be. As it turns out, as we were having this conversation in 2020, 2021, I already would have made the case that it was impossible to separate politics and sports. But because of COVID, Black Lives Matter, and various other conversations, it became inarguable for even casual observers. So it was an inevitable conclusion, it felt like, in retrospect, that we would focus on politics in particular. And we had the right team of people. So I want to give full credit to my colleague and friend, Dr. Natalie Brown Devlin, who's an associate professor in our School of Advertising and Public Relations. And she co-writes and co-coordinates the report and actually does the bulk of the work on the quantitative side, which I know we'll get to. And then also at the time, Dr. Jennifer McLaren was a professor in the radio, TV, and film department. And so she had the oversight initially of our critical case study components. And so I was able to play a role, but we had other people who were really shepherding the work in the report. And then all of the contributions came from our affiliates, faculty and graduate students initially. Now we also have some undergraduates each year who will participate in the report. So it was the right time and the right combination of talent and expertise that allowed us to to launch this. And so the first report debuted in January of 2022, looking back on the year 2021 when so many of these conversations were really vital.
And you mentioned you had this existing interest in studying politics and sport. Like, where did that come from, and how early in your academic life did you sort of define that as a specialty?
So I've long had an interest in both politics and sports. I moved around a lot as a kid, and sports was a really important anchor so that I always had something that I was paying attention to. And I was fascinated with sports history, statistics, collecting baseball cards, all of those kinds of things. And that was really important when, you move in as a kid to new places and you're not sure who your people are going to be and all of that. And
Mhm.
then at a relatively early age, by middle school, I was interested in politics as well. So those have long been things that I've paid attention to. When I made the decision to go back and get my PhD, I was a tenured community college professor in the suburbs of Chicago, the College of Lake County, and had a very good job there. I was treated really, really well. I just decided that I wanted a more research intensive opportunity and I wanted to teach courses that were at an advanced level. And I made the decision, if I'm going to go back to get a PhD, let me do something at this intersection of things that I think are really interesting. And in my field of rhetorical studies at that time, had been given very little attention. And so it already was the thing I wanted to do. And then again, timing being what it was, I started my PhD program in the fall of 2002, which was the first full fall semester following 9/11. And sports and 9/11 overlapped in all kinds of ways that became really central to the work that I did at the time and have continued to do. So, as far as my career from the moment that I started my PhD to now, it has been exclusively focused on the relationship between politics and sports.
Okay, and I mean, have you noticed just a change in the way that that is accepted in academic circles over the course of your career? I remember when I was a college student at Vanderbilt and was interested in just writing a paper about Perry Wallace, which eventually became a book a couple of decades later. I was really concerned my professor was going to say, we don't write about basketball players in college, and I always had this chip on my shoulder that people didn't really consider sports legit, on a college campus. But feels like that has changed a lot over the years. Has that been your experience?
It has. There are remaining pockets of resistance.
Hmm.
Rhetorical studies as a discipline, fancies itself as being focused on matters of public affairs, and that leads us naturally to politics in more formal settings. And the history of the field, going back to its ancient origins, is rooted in practices of public address, of speech making. And so the field has evolved, over several decades has evolved to account for social movements and forms of popular culture that are connected to politics. But there are a lot of reasons why sports stands out as a site of some resistance to that. And I think part of it is that academics aren't always big sports fans in general. And at research institutions like ours, sometimes the presence of major sports can feel in tension with the academic mission of the university. So there are
Hmm.
various reasons and explanations for it, I'm sure. Depending on the area, communication studies is such a big tent discipline. Yes, my field is rhetorical studies, which focuses on political and public affairs. Media studies, mass communication has long focused on forms of popular culture, including sports. And so that area of our field was out in front of this much earlier than my area was. But I think a number of things have happened. Probably the single most significant moment, at least in the 21st century, that has refashioned attitudes about why it is or isn't important to study sports is the take a knee conversation that centered primarily around Colin Kaepernick. And I frame it that way because he really wasn't the first athlete to resist in that moment, but because he was an NFL player, all of the attention was concentrated there. And that moment really captured attention, I think, for popular media and observers and academics as well. And so there's much less open resistance to it than I would have seen 20, 25 years ago.
Okay. Okay. Early in the report, in the intro, I think, it talks about how for a lot of people, the way sports is talked about is that brings people together, or it can be an escape from the headlines of everyday life. And maybe that's true to some extent, but it is inseparable from politics and all the real world issues that are out there. In your survey, the quantitative side of this report, where did people come down on whether they appreciate it, they like it when athletes use their platform to talk about politics, or when politicians insert themselves uh, into the sports world?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to the idea that sports can bring people together. That unity theme is a pervasive one in sports, and I don't want to suggest that there's not potential in that. My personal worry, and I'll answer the second part of your question immediately afterwards. My personal worry is that we use that unity for cover to distract us from the things that are happening behind the scenes that, or maybe even aren't behind the scenes, that we should be much more critical about. And so if we're all waving the flag together and throwing up our arms in celebration together, maybe we're not paying attention to the foreign policy choices, domestic policy choices, things of that nature. And so, especially when government actors are directly involved in trying to create this idea of unity, that's when I get most suspicious of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there are really no comparable institutions that bring people together in the massive number of people, the large numbers of people that we can bring together in sports as often as we do in sports. You could go to a single Taylor Swift concert, but your community, if you could travel around the country and see Taylor Swift everywhere, I suppose, right? But your community will get Taylor Swift maybe once a year. And so that's a big event. It's with a lot of people. But if you're going to Vandy football games, that's at least eight is six times, seven times. If you're going to Predators games, now you've got dozens of times. And sports really is the only place that can do that. So I think the survey results show us that people want to hold on to that. They value that. Um, there is relative stability over 5 years now in terms of perceptions about whether or not athletes, teams, and leagues should be political. There is some difference between party affiliation. So when we do the surveys, we do ask people to self-report if they are Democrat, Republican, or independent. That is not a perfect way to capture what people's ideological sensibilities are, but it is because it's self-reported, it's how people imagine themselves in politics. Democrats, self-identifying Democrats, are far more willing or even enthusiastic about athletes in particular sharing their political views. Republicans are far more resistant to that. Both tend to be resistant to teams and leagues sharing their views. So it's interesting that athletes as individual figures get a little bit more flexibility, particularly among Democratic identifying participants. But the one thing that I think is interesting about this is I would make the case that Democrats and Republicans alike do not always recognize their own politics when they show up. And that might skew more toward Republican identifying participants, if only because of the types of things that they're comfortable with politically that might stand out otherwise. But an example I'll use of that is I went to an Austin FC game not too long ago. It happened to be Pride Night. And for Pride Night, in the supporters and the fan group unfurled a giant tifo with, they're always beautifully done artistically. And it had a big slogan that said, "Don't mess with trans Texas." And of course, that's a play off the famous "Don't Mess with Texas" environmental campaign that has come to mean so much more over the
Mhm.
decades. And immediately behind me, I heard one of the fans, a young group of guys that were there, and I heard a fan kind of sigh and say, "Oh, can we just play soccer?" And what was interesting to me about that was not only that he was clearly frustrated that there was an identity politics statement being made, is that that moment happened immediately after the national anthem ceremony and ritual, at which, to my recollection, the fan behind me participated in willingly and enthusiastically and did not recognize that as being political in any way.
Mhm.
And so the anthem, the choice to have an anthem is a political choice. Most of us are accustomed to it, comfortable with it, and so we don't think about it as a political choice. So the survey data can't quite capture that, but I think there are some really interesting indicators that tell us that people don't always see the politics that are happening in sports.
Yeah, and related to that, I was wondering, are you able to, I don't know if you can tell through survey responses, but it seems like people are, they may say they don't want it to mix, but if the athlete or the team is making a statement they agree with, they're typically fine with it. Or they might say, yeah, every athlete has a right to speak out, but if I disagree, I'm going to complain about that on social media. How honest are people about that side of things?
Yeah, I think, obviously, again, survey data can have certain biases and, the tendency to want to answer the way we think we're supposed to answer, or things that help us confirm our corresponding worldview.
Mhm.
And right, if we say we don't want athletes to speak out about politics, do we really mean that when it's across the ideological spectrum, or is it just the athletes we don't like or the
Right.
political positions we don't like? And
Mhm.
that definitely is, we have reason to think that that's present in the data. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Dr. Harry Edwards has been here on campus, and he talks about the different waves of Black athlete activism. When you think about that, and just that there have been times throughout 20th century or early 21st century, like when athletes have or have not typically spoken out much. Like, where are we on that pendulum right now, do you think?
Early in 2026 is a really interesting moment to ask that question, Andrew, because I think it's possible we might see the pendulum swing back in favor of some more outspoken athletes, given what has happened in Minneapolis and elsewhere, and the conversation about immigration and ICE and authority in this country. I would say coming into 2026, we were clearly swinging away from athlete activism. What we saw in 2020 and 2021, which would have been fifth wave for Edwards, he had kind of
Mhm.
framed four waves before that, um, was a real surge in athletes being vocal. And of course, part of that was fueled by the fact that we couldn't play sports at all for several months during the pandemic. And so it just amplified everything, and it gave people space to be outspoken. I think it was inevitable that there would be some fatigue, and on all sides, right? Fatigue from those who are protesting, fatigue from those who don't want to hear about protesting anymore. And at a certain point, these things do have life cycles. There's a momentum and an event, a moment when things start to quiet down a little bit. Um, Part of that is the news cycle changes. Part of that is we got back to playing games. Part of that maybe policy changes that leagues may or may not have implemented. So by 2023, even if not even before that, we had probably seen a reduction in the frequency of athlete protest. So I don't claim to make any predictions. I think that's a risky proposition, but I think it certainly would be possible that we would see another surge in it, and in part because political expression in sports has overwhelmingly been driven by Black athletes because of various historical factors and exclusions. And so, if to the extent that's a population that identifies with what's happening right now, and it's not always that's not a clear overlap in this case, I think we may see, some renewed interest there.
Hmm. Your surveys also measure how people perceive various media outlets and the way that they cover this intersection between sports and politics. What did you discover this year? Is it any different significantly than what the surveys have revealed in the past?
We've got very strong consistency here. Over 5 years, essentially identical results. And what we're seeing are a couple of things. One is that in terms of brands that are viewed as most reliable, ESPN continues to lead the way, which is unsurprising just given the ubiquity of ESPN. There might not even be another media brand that people would quickly think of, especially if we're thinking about a national brand.
Hmm.
The other thing is that's interesting is that, especially among Democrats, Fox Sports is perceived as being the most conservative outlet. Especially among Republicans, NBC Sports is perceived as being the most liberal outlet. And our judgment is that if you just take the sports networks on their own terms, ideologically, they're relatively interchangeable. But it's clear that the parent network is, or the partner news network is driving that perception. So Fox Sports must be conservative because it's connected to Fox News, and MSNBC must have an effect on NBC Sports, and so that's been an interesting thing that we see implicitly that connection being made.
Okay. And then your report is not just surveys, there are some great essays there. How did you go about the process of deciding what to write about from a large universe of potential topics?
Yeah, it's an interesting process each time because there are so many, as you suggest, so many different things we could write about. So what I do is over the course of the year, I'll keep a running list of topics that might end up being suitable. And then come September, October, we start having meetings. We have a full meeting of the entire group of folks who might contribute to the report. For the fifth report that just was published, we had 22 contributors, 5 faculty, 15 graduate students, and 2 undergraduate students. So we try to get everybody together for a large group meeting and then decide who's going to be on the quantitative team working with the surveys and content analysis, and then who's going to be on the case study team. So once we do that, then the case study team will meet separately and we start to go through the list that I've assembled, and then we add others that people have in mind that I haven't been able to capture. Usually, we're talking about 2 or 3 dozen possible topics. And what we try to do, you go back and I look at something that I put down on the list in March, and I sometimes I'm not even sure what it was,
Right.
right? So you think, okay, that's probably not going to make it into the report in that case. But some are just very obvious that they're going to need to be part of the report. We put that in context with 2 other factors. One is what have we written about in the past? Because we don't want to simply reproduce the same argument or cover the same territory we've done in the past. And two, uh, are we balancing our attention across different sports and types of political questions? So, in a sports media ecosystem where the NFL takes up, this is not an official stat, 90% of the oxygen in the room, we could write about NFL stories all day long, but we don't want all 5 or 6 case studies to be just about the NFL. So we try to look for some balance. We're very mindful of equity concerns and making sure that we're not just reproducing some of the political distinctions that we might observe. And then we also will find out who's interested in which topic. And sometimes it's a product of somebody really wants to champion a particular topic, and so off we go.
Okay. So Super Bowl coming up as we record this, just in a couple days. Bad Bunny is the subject of one of the essays here. I'm sure some people listening have never even heard of Bad Bunny. I was talking to someone today that had not heard there was going to be an alternative halftime show this year. How would you describe the Bad Bunny controversy and what his story represents in this year of sports and politics?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It's the first time that we've written about something that hasn't actually happened yet. The focus of that essay, Paulina Serrano, who wrote that, is on the emergent controversy when Bad Bunny was first announced, and the pushback from some to suggest that because he doesn't sing primarily in English, that therefore he's not American. And of course, we're finding out there. I know that I believe it's The Athletic just did a survey of NFL players to get their sense of, do they support Bad Bunny? Do they like Bad Bunny? What do they think? And there have been some interesting one-off comments here or there that suggest people you don't know who he is, don't realize that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, so he has citizenship, right? And so for us, the thing that was particularly interesting is that the controversy over Bad Bunny's appearance is reflective of a larger conversation about what does it mean to be American at a moment when, you've got a president with a very obvious slogan about making America great and conceptions about what the nation's values are supposed to be. How are those values represented and symbolized? And so for some, Bad Bunny symbolizes a rejection of those ideals, and for others, he's the very embodiment of that. And that's the tension that we thought was particularly interesting. So it is theoretically possible we would write about it again next year. Again, we tend not to reproduce the same topics, but given that we now are going to have the turning point counter programming, and we'll see what kind of reaction the performance generates, it's certainly going to be on our radar at minimum.
Hmm. Um, Speaking of, sports on television, it is impossible to miss all of the ads for the sports gambling companies. Driving to, I take my kids to school in the morning, and billboards, that you're confronted with for all the different apps for sports gambling. I love the term sports media gambling complex that was used in the headline for your essay, for your products essay on this topic. Um, and there's so many ways to come at this angle of sports betting. How it influences the performance on the field, as we've seen a couple of baseball pitchers or college basketball players, the addiction issues, and then you're taking a look at really just how the sports media is in bed with the whole concept of it. Can you talk a little bit about the focus of that essay?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Katie Hartzell, the author of that, is a doctoral candidate in radio, TV, film who's really interested in media industries and the way these relationships reflect different conceptions of influence and power. And of course, that's all driven by money. And, gambling was a holdout for a long, long time. This was something that leagues and media entities tried to stay clear of for fear of bad influences. There's just so much money trading hands that has all more or less dissipated. One of my favorite moments of 2025 from a sports media and politics standpoint was when the NBA scandal broke, and ESPN was doing coverage of Terry Rozier and Chauncey Billups's arrest with Mike Greenberg from ESPN doing the sort of standard talking head report, and the ESPN bet graphic was down in the bottom corner at the same time, and eventually somebody realized it and it came down. And then just mere weeks later, if not days, I don't remember the timeline exactly now, ESPN announced that it was not going to have that relationship with ESPN Bet any longer because they were going to do a relationship with DraftKings instead. And you combine ESPN's influence alone, again, come back to the biggest, the worldwide leader in sports, biggest brand in US sports, their influence alone connected with gambling, and then having an equity stake in the National Football League that has now been cleared. And you've got all of these different conflicts of interest that are happening. I think it's really, really worrisome for various reasons. It has infiltrated the product in ways that I'm old enough to be nostalgic for a day when, the worst gambling influence you could see was Jimmy the Greek making picks in the morning,
Yeah,
right? And then it went away, right? And I'm not anti-gambling. I'm not suggesting that it's inherently all bad, but it's just become so totalizing. You can't scroll anywhere without it. You can't watch anything on screen without it. And ultimately the focus in that essay in the report is on, the unintended consequence, which is that the athletes tend to be singled out when they're complicit in some way. Um, but they're also the ones who are probably going to be subjected to the most scrutiny and potentially hostility because too many people are making bad judgments about how much money they can afford to lose. And then when they lose it, it's the athlete's fault. And there are some real concerns about where that could go.
absolutely. I know that's the case for very many college athletes who have just been the DMs they get are unbelievable. All right, so there's four more essays in the report. I won't spoil the whole thing for everybody, but before we go, I wanted to ask you just when we think about sports media, and I know your program also awards the Jenkins Prize every year and really keeps tabs on the best sports writing that's out there. And I've got a lot of friends, former and current, at the Washington Post, and it's
Mm.
we don't know how much longer that sports department will exist. From your chair there and the students that you're working with, some ways it seems like sports is more ubiquitous in the media than ever. In other ways, it seems like the jobs are fewer and far between. Like, what is the status of sports media these days? And even if it's a case of, well, just times are changing and things are shifting, like what's lost when we do lose potentially what has been regarded as a great sports section, like the Washington Post sports section?
Yeah, what's happening at the Post is just really dreadful. I share the perspective of many that that's the best sports newsroom in the country and has been for some time. We've had some of our award winners for the Jenkins Medal, Dave Sheinin, Sally Jenkins, right? Folks who have won that medal. It's really hard to watch that happen. And yes, part of it is an inevitable change that that what we knew is no longer the way that things are structured. And so I think part of it is beyond our control, and part of it is maybe a natural progression. There are plenty of jobs and there's plenty of content creation that's happening in sports media. I think what is potentially at risk of being lost is finding the answer or a balance to the answer of whose interests are being served when we're creating the content. And having a top tier sports desk at a daily like the Washington Post makes sure that various interests are served, including the interests of the readers and including the interests that readers may not realize that they have. We're shifting more and more of that content creation out of sort of independent traditional forms of journalism and in-house. So it's going into organizations, it's going under conglomerate media corporations that maybe don't have as expansive a view of capturing multiple interests. So their interests tend to be ownership focused, organizational focused, capital focused. None of that, again, is necessarily or always wrong or bad, but it does mean that it gives us less space for critical inquiry, investigative inquiry, for challenging things that feel like they maybe aren't serving a public well. And so, to the extent that a public newspaper can be the watchdog, can be the fourth estate, that's a really important function. And I think we're at risk of seeing that erode.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. What type of students do you have, or when students come to study, grad students with you, what are they typically looking to do, or what are some recent stories that come to mind?
Yeah, well, if it's graduate students, most of those are going to be focused on wanting academic careers and being interested in researching how sports media works and historically how it has worked. We do have a master's level sports communications certificate program, which partners with a couple of other certificates where students can combine 2 out of 3 programs and create a master's degree, which is a bit more professionally focused. So those students are overwhelmingly interested in media relations, media production, game day production kind of stuff. And then our undergraduate students are interested in the whole range. We get a lot of students who want to do play-by-play or other studio host or studio analyst kind of on-camera things, lots of social media interest. I've been impressed by the number of excellent photographers that I've seen come through sports photography. Um, and then, of course, things that happen in media organizations, in offices, right? Marketing, promotions, advertising, all of those related kinds of industries. So a pretty full range. Again, because of that shift to the SEC that we have had at the University of Texas, we have more opportunities for students to do game day related work. And a lot of students who come to us and think they want to be on camera and, I'm going to be the next ESPN Sports Center anchor. All of us have some version of that, and we all say, yes, get in line. There are a whole bunch of people who want to do that. They often find out that there are lots of other really neat things that they can do. And so maybe they're going to end up in social media, or they're going to be a filmmaker, or they'll go into advertising. There's a whole giant world that is growing in sports and sports media.
Yeah, well, it's a great program. And then I'm old school enough that I printed out my
I
PDF
love it.
of your politics and sports media. If people are interested in reading the whole thing, where can they find it?
They can find it at politicsinsportsmedia.org, and just spelled straight through, politicsinsportsmedia.org. Also could, of course, visit the Center for Sports Communication and Media homepage and find it through our links there, but the direct way is just to go straight to the site.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you again for taking the time to come talk about this report. I always have appreciated your friendship and the invitations to come to Austin, which is a city that means a lot to me, having lived there when I was a high school student at Austin High, loyal forever Maroons, and look forward to next time you're able to come back to Nashville.
Yeah, thanks a bunch, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And
All
thanks
right.
for giving us a chance to publicize the report.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.